And law enforcement in Florida have made at least 2 arrests for voter intimidation. One of those, a man in Palm Beach County, Florida, where the sheriff's office says Nicholas Farley showed up at a polling site shouting anti-Semitic remarks about a candidate and driving recklessly, scaring voters away. In another incident, it was reported over in Neptune Beach, Florida. Police say a teenage Trump supporter was waving a machete at Harris supporters outside of a polling spot there. A lot to discuss about legalities here, so I do want to bring in Jonathan Diaz, Director of Voting Advocacy and Partnerships at the Campaign Legal Center. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Good morning.
Good morning. Well, I do want to talk about legalities, as I mentioned. Can you define essentially what voter intimidation really is? Is it a full-fledged crime, and what sort of penalties could you face?
Yes, federal and state law make it a crime for any person to intimidate, threaten, or coerce somebody in an attempt to interfere with their right to vote. Under federal law, voter intimidation is punishable by jail time, as well as pretty serious criminal and civil fines. And many states have similar penalties for conduct that is intended to or actually does interfere with Americans' right to vote.
What types of voter intimidation would actually be considered illegal? I'm sure there are maybe different types there, but which are the ones that are considered illegal, where somebody could be charged?
So voter intimidation can take many forms. I think the most obvious being actual violence or threatened violence against voters, election workers, or volunteers. But there are subtler forms of voter intimidation that can lead to legal liability under certain circumstances, including threatening financial or employment consequences, or publishing someone's personal information online, doxing them because they voted or didn't vote a certain way. Following people home, filming them, making them feel unsafe, all depending on the circumstances, can constitute voter intimidation.
And I talked a little leading into this about the 2 cases over in Florida that have been reported by authorities there. So verbal threats, that is considered to be illegal voter intimidation, right?
It can be, depending on the circumstances. And I think verbal threats often give context to threatening conduct, like brandishing a weapon. We heard about the story about the teenager wielding a machete in Florida. The thing to remember about voter intimidation laws is that the context really matters. When, where, and most importantly, how a threat is delivered are all important factors that weigh in on whether or not conduct constitutes illegal voter intimidation.
Does it matter if the voter intimidation actually prevents someone from voting? Does that factor in, or is it just an issue of, okay, you intimidated voters?
It's certainly a factor, but it's important to remember that federal and state law criminalize attempts at voter intimidation as well, whether they're successful or not. So if you prevent someone from voting, that certainly is evidence weighing in favor of a finding of voter intimidation. But just because somebody is able to overcome threatening or intimidating conduct and still exercise their right to vote doesn't mean you're necessarily off the hook.
Not to get too technically speaking here, but you are the expert. So can you kind of go over some of the history of voter intimidation? I know that's a very broad question, but just kind of going over some of the history there.
Sure. Looking back over the almost 250 years of United States history, there is an unfortunate history of voter intimidation across many periods of American history. I think viewers are probably familiar with images from the post-Civil War era, for example, where hooded figures on horseback wielding weapons would run people off the roads, or the images that many of us are familiar with from the 1960s of law enforcement or self-appointed militias turning fire hoses and dogs on voters or people marching for the right to vote. The methods have shifted in our modern times. A lot of harassment takes place online now, for example. And that's why these state and federal laws exist. That's why they were adopted and have continued to be used to make sure that voters are protected and are able to cast their ballots without fear.
Someone comes to you and says, I've experienced this voter intimidation. What do you tell them? What is your advice for them?
I would say every American voter has the right to cast their ballot safely, without fear, and privately. And any voter that feels that someone has attempted to intimidate, threaten, or coerce them into voting or not voting a certain way should notify their local election official right away. And they can also reach out to local law enforcement or the Department of Justice, which has an election threats task force. I would also encourage voters to report any instances of voter intimidation to the National Nonpartisan Election Protection Hotline at 866-OUR-VOTE.
What if they're not necessarily sure if it is categorized as voter intimidation, or maybe they just have their feelings hurt, something of that nature? Does that change it?
I would say that, it's important to remember that even attempts to intimidate voters, whether or not they're successful, can still be actionable under federal and state law. And it never hurts to report information to law enforcement or to your local election official and let them make the determination of whether or not something rises to the level of illegal voter intimidation.
All right, Jonathan Diaz, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. Anything else you want to add really about any of this before I let you go?
I think that democracy really only works when everyone is able to participate. We want our election results to reflect the will of the people. And I want voters to feel confident that they will be able to cast their ballots safely, securely, and without fear, and that their votes will be counted.
All right, Jonathan, thank you again for being here with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.